pages 42 to 45 of The Perfect Hamburger. Now, do you remember that Joe and Mr. Borthwick have gone to see the great Casseroli? Ah, look at the front cover. That must be who the third person is. We were wondering about that, weren't we? So Joe and Mr. Borthwick have gone to see the great Casseroli, who has said he is far too busy to possibly be able to help them. And in fact, he's been really rather rude. But to be fair, they did go into a kitchen that had a sign on the door saying entry forbidden. So it is possible to see why Chef Casseroli is being somewhat impatient with him. And it's true, he does have a job to be getting on with. So the Chef Casseroli has his nose in the tin of spice, do you remember? Mr. Borthwick looked hopeful. "Can you recognise it?" he asked. Casseroli looked embarrassed. "I cannot," he said crossly. "It must be a very rare spice." "But Maestro," pleaded Mr. Borthwick, and Maestro is someone who is a master of what they do. "Surely you have tasted it somewhere before. You must have." Casseroli shook his head regretfully and handed the tin back to Mr. Borthwick. "I am sorry," he said, "but even the great Casseroli has never tasted this spice." Mr. Borthwick and Joe must have looked so crestfallen at the news that even the great Casseroli for a moment forgot his pride. "There is one other possibility," he said quietly. "Eating in this hotel at this very moment is one of the world's great gourmets, a truly great food expert. We will ask him. Perhaps he will tell us." "Thank you," said Mr. Borthwick. "You see, it is very important to us to be able to find more of this spice." Mr. Borthwick didn't dare mention hamburgers because he knew that to the great Casseroli, hamburgers would be beneath contempt. Such a great chef had probably never even seen a hamburger. Do you think that's true? Joe, Mr. Borthwick, and the great Casseroli left the kitchen and entered the grand dining room of the Excelsior. Remember, that's the name of the hotel they're in. In front of them stretched table after table of starched white tablecloths and gleaming silver. In the middle of the room, a vast candelabra of crystal glowed with 100 points of light. Sounds very beautiful and very fancy in there, doesn't it? As the great Casseroli entered the room, many of the diners looked up from their plates to stare at him. Then, at several tables at the same time, groups of diners rose to their feet and clapped their hands in enthusiastic applause. The chef stopped, bowed, and waved to those who had applauded. Wow, he really must be a great chef, mustn't he? If when he goes into the restaurant, the people eating his food stand up and give him a clap. Then, together with his two companions, he made his way towards a table in the corner of the room, where a tall man in a black suit and bow tie was dining with a woman bedecked with glittering jewels. As the famous gourmet saw Casseroli approach, he rose to his feet and made a small bow towards the chef. Then he looked in the direction of Mr. Borthwick and Joe and made a small bow towards them as well. Casseroli introduced them to the man and the woman. He was called Mr. Octavius and his friend was called Miss Cadillac. "We have come to ask your advice," Casseroli said in an important voice. Mr. Octavius smiled modestly. "But, my dear charming Casseroli, who am I to advise you?" he said. So even the famous gourmet, the famous expert in food, is saying that his knowledge is probably nothing compared with Chef Casseroli's. This chef is obviously a super chef indeed. Okay, that's it for today.